Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, Germany prepares to go to the polls this Sunday with Chancellor Angela Merkel's party leading in the polls. Could she pull off a run for a fourth term? Defeated U.S. presidential candidate Hilary Clinton comes out with a book, What Happened? That answers the biggest question of all, or has it? What led to her defeat when the odds are stacked against her opponent? And we begin in Germany, where federal elections will be held on Sunday to elect members of the Bundestag. The new Bundestag will elect a chancellor with an absolute majority of its members, who will in turn form a new government. Chancellor Angela Merkel is running for a fourth term, and if the polls are right, she is headed for 4 more years at the top in Germany. This is the first national vote since Merkel government opened Germany's doors to an influx of migrants and refugees in the year 2015. Many with far-right sentiments are also looking at Germany's anti-immigration, anti-Islam alternative. And for more on German election, let's turn to our panel. In Beijing studio, we have Mr. Cui Hongjian with us, the Director of the Department for European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. In Berlin, we invited Timo Lokocki, a transatlantic fellow with the Europe program at the German Marshall Fund. Welcome as well. Joining us in Brussels, Paul Ivan, Senior Policy Analyst of the European Policy Center. Welcome. I want to begin with you, Mr. Lokocki. Of course, only days before the election, but it seems that all the media are pointing their fingers to one person and one person only, Mrs. Merkel, once again likely to be the biggest winner.
Well, she most certainly will come out as the leader of the strongest party, which will mean she will be the head of the next government, for which Social Democrats are deprived of the numbers of the seats and the coalition partners to form a government against Angela Merkel's conservatives. However, whether she will come out as the strongest winner of this election is a very different question, because she was polling quite well a few weeks ago at 40%, and now the CDU-CSU is down about to 35% in certain polls. So she might win the election, but she might not be considered as the biggest winner.
Yeah, but Mr. Lokocki, just very briefly, having witnessed what the last election was about in the United States, do you really believe in polls?
Well, that's a fair assumption, but the German voters are not as volatile as the American or the British voters. There is a certain amount of German voters which are still undecided. About 1/4 of German voters, that is true. However, given that the CDU-CSU was polling ahead by 10 to 12% to the Social Democrats, it's hardly imaginable that the German pollsters are that off that the SPD could still oust the Chancellor from power.
All right, Mr. Ivan, I did notice an adjective used by Mr. Lokocki coming from Germany, saying not that volatile compared to the American voters, the European voters in Germany. But what is your understanding of this election? It seems that even though it is arguably whether Mrs. Merkel going to be the strongest politician standing after this election, but she was holding on to the power for 12 years. Likely her party continued to be.
No, clearly it's quite a feat, the fact that Mrs. Merkel remained in power for so long, and as we can see from the opinion polls for all these last months, the German voters seem to prefer this stability offered by a leader who has been in power for the last decade, and who they trust, and especially now, given let's say the difficult international climate in which we see developments such as the Brexit vote, the American elections, but also the number of crises in both in EU's neighborhood, also in other parts of the world, even in your parts of the world. If we look at the North Korean crisis, it's clear that many voters want to go for what they know and what they trust.
Yeah, Chancellor Merkel is expected to win the general election, as both of you have mentioned, at least her party, her CDU party, is expected to win 36%. Her main opponent, Martin Schulz, SPD party, is polling at 22%. And the right-wing AFD is polling at 11%. Left-wing is also 11%, while the FDP and the Greens are polling at 9%, 7% respectively, even though the number could be changing from time to time, 3 to 5% respectively. But the overall picture is generally quite clear. Mr. Cui, how do you read this continuity about one party in power in Germany over the past 12 years likely to continue? Is this trend likely to be in a way, the trend for many other European countries to follow?
Yeah, I think that we can find some very important reasons for this continuity of the politics in Germany and also this, CDU government. Maybe I think one of the most important reasons is a very, very good or excellent, economic, growth in Germany, especially under the ruling of the CDU government. And of course, at the same time, I think another very important reason is a very, very special political culture in Germany, because it's very different. It's very special from other European countries, especially when the left party and the right party. It's not so fresh for them to have a grand coalition, which means a very, very strong, compromise between the different parties. So I think it's a very special model, and it could not be, transferred to other European countries.
Mr. Lukaku, do you agree with that? What will this coalition be like? That is going to be the biggest question mark.
Well, it's difficult to say whether the Germans will continue with a grand coalition. And even though the country did quite well with the grand coalition between the SPD and the CDU-CSU, there is a big chunk of German voters which are very discontent with this grand coalition because it guarantees stability, but it also leads to a lack of contentious debates. The Germans actually, before the last 10 years, used to argue a lot about politics. There used to be a lot of polarization, especially about economic matters. So there's a lot of German voters who crave that time where debates were contentious, passionate, and emotional. So there's a lot of Germans who would like to see the SPD becoming the strongest opposition force so they can push the CDU-CSU, so that they can push emotional and contentious debates again.
Well, they wish to, but will they really function like that? That is maybe not the case. Mr. Lukaku, very briefly from you.
Yes, definitely. We do not quite know whether the CDU-CSU can form a sufficient coalition with any other party but the Social Democrats. The CDU-CSU is currently polling, as you said, at 36 to 38%, which means in order to get 48%, they need to form a stable coalition. They need a strong, small party, the Liberals or the Greens. But it seems like they might be too weak to join a coalition with the CDU-CSU, and then people keep talking about a so-called Jamaica coalition. Jamaica because it's black, green, and yellow. Yellow is the Liberals, green the Greens, and black is the Conservatives. So they could try to form a coalition against the Social Democrats and the left and the right, but this coalition would be very, very new, so we do not know if it's really working. And if that's not working, the grand coalition is the option of last resort.
Yeah. Mr. Cui, China is watching this from afar, but there has been enormous respect coming from this country toward what Germany has gone through and be able to achieve. Having said that, though, many wonder whether that has anything to do with the very stable continuity of politics, with one politician quite powerful and capable, such as Mrs. Merkel, in power for 12 years, and the coalition be able to be smoothly established and smoothly carrying out their compromises. Mr. Cui, what is your analysis here?
Yeah, exactly. Just like I mentioned before, that it's difficult for other European countries to copy the model of political culture from Germany. But indeed, and so far, as we know, Germany achieved a lot, not only on economic and also on political policy continuity. So it's now it's giving a very, very strong message to other European countries to try to learn something from German experience.
Well, you might say so, but others would say, Mr. Ivan, politics should be colorful. You can't just have the same person there 12 years, 16 years, maybe 20 years, 25 years. Well, at the same time, you see the opponent, for example, Mr. Scholz, has been, with the European Parliament, quite a stable political figure, but not that much colorful. So what does it say about the German politics? And especially now these days, you see the youth, the young people are following Mrs. Merkel like crazy, got big support among the youth. How should we interpret this?
Well, mentioning Mr. Scholz, we saw that when he returned to Germany, his popularity also spiked for a period, and then it decreased. At the same time, we do have some movement. I mean, if we look at some of the smaller parties entering into, that are likely to enter into parliament, we see the Liberals, who are very likely to return to parliament after a period in which they were out. More worryingly, we see on the extreme right the AfD, a populist party that is likely to enter into parliament, and thus to be the first populist party to enter the German parliament after the end of the Second World War. So there is a certain political movement in the country. The majority of the population clearly prefers to vote for the mainstream parties, and again, some of the reasons were given here in the discussion. Germany had a very good economic period. It registered almost 2% growth. Unemployment has decreased. So I assume many German voters ask themselves if the situation is good, if the economy is growing, why risk it? In the end, it is for them to decide who they want to be their leader.
But there has been a lot of debate about that. Exactly who created the sustainable growth of the German economy? Mr. Lukaku, you know that there has been debate about whether the current administration is really responsible for that, whether Chancellor Merkel is the one that has cultivated that throughout the years, whether the previous administration actually have done all the hard jobs, the policy that people, some of them, do not want to like, and yet it really paved the way for today's sustainable growth. A lot of debate about that. Mr. Lukaku.
Well, you're totally right. You stressed that Chancellor Merkel is in power for 12 years, and this ensures stability. That is true, but this stability comes at a price, because Germany is deprived and lacking very substantial economic reforms it actually needs. Throughout the last 12 years, there were hardly any economic reforms undertaken. The ones which are in charge of the economic successes date back to the democratic tutelage 12 years ago, and Germany is benefiting massively from the international investment climate, which leads to German products being very highly interested and sought after at the world market. The euro helps the German economy, and the low interest rates. So actually there is a very dark flip side to this German stability that Germany is dominated by one party for so long. For one, Germany needs economic reforms the Chancellor hasn't undertook. And for the other, there's a lot of German voters which do not feel represented at all by this government. And they now flock to the far right, to the Alternative for Germany, and the liberals. So I wouldn't say that there's a lot of German voters which definitely do not like the stability. They want reforms, they want their voice to be heard.
Right.
Stability and success is something very different.
Yes, it's very different, particularly in politics. We are talking about Mr. Ivan. Yet the question is Mrs. Merkel, if her party is once again become the winner, and she is going to be the biggest winner of her party, if that is the case, going to push for that reform? Because she's been there for 12 years, and she hasn't done that. But the question is, maybe she's going to do it this time, because she's going to have another surplus of 4 years to go. So will that question still in people's mind when they go to the voting polls? Mr. Ivan?
What is clear, looking from outside, is that we will have more parties into the parliament, that the governing coalition might not be one between two parties, but might even be one from three parties, which these elements would make, let's say, any attempt to push courageous reform more difficult. Even a grand coalition is likely not the best setup to push reforms, if that were to be the intention of the CDU. So I would say difficult at this point, as we don't know yet also exactly which parties will form the governing coalitions. As I mentioned earlier, and also to come in continuation to what was said previously, there is clear movement, and clearly not everybody is happy with the sort of stability.
Certainly, when you talk about
this happens happened in other European countries as well.
Well, there is stability, but on the other hand, there is not that much stability. Mr. Cui, you understand earlier there has been some migrant crisis going on, and certain policies have not been very much well accepted back at home in Germany by Chancellor Merkel. And she has changed her policy, her stance. Of course, things quiet down. And yet, with another 4 or 5 years to go, the party who's in charge, the coalition who is at work, and the chancellor, whoever is there in the office, have to give some concrete answers to all of these questions, Mr. Cui.
I don't think there will be another time for Chancellor Merkel to try to push for some reforms like you mentioned before, because I don't think that according to her personality, Ms. Merkel is not active reformist. But of course, she is good at managing any kind of a crisis like the refugee and the migration issue. One of the her few problems was criticized by public or other countries in Europe. But I think that how to say this, the when or the new coalition dominated by Ms. Merkel will be a very, very strong symbol to this stability of German politics firstly, and then European politics. So I think just like some European media mentioned that it's a very, very boring election for this moment, but that's fine for Germany and for Europe.
All right. Before we go, 40 seconds left for you, Mr. Lokaki. Of course, the joke is everybody in Germany call Mrs. Merkel the Mutti, meaning mom in German language. And that, in a way, describe what she is like in people's minds. Will that still be the case with this election?
That's a very good question. Well, there's a lot of Germans who want to get a divorce from Mutti, if you want to put it that way. A lot of Germans on the far right want to get rid of her, and the other Germans hoping that she is preventing the Germans from having to undertake crucial economic Eurozone or migration efforts. So the Germans will probably see a very different Mutti in the coming years, because pressing reforms in the Eurozone, migration, defense, global trade are needed and asked from her. So Germans' view on her Mutti will probably change in the next years.
I see. The news program and World Insight with Tian Wei of CGTN will bring you all the latest of the German election, as we are bringing you special programs for the next few days with the latest of the German election. Big day for Germany, and certainly big day for Europe as well. But for now, let me thank the three of you, Timo Lokaki and Paul Ivan, Cui Hongjian. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, still to come on our program. From a virtual shoe-in as the first female U.S. president to a most disappointing bitter defeat, Hilary Clinton tells all in What Happened. We'll have the news on her new book and the role of female politicians these days in the world right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Perhaps one of the biggest puzzles of the year 2017 is why Hilary Clinton, a highly experienced candidate, lost the U.S. presidential campaign. Well, in her book, Length Reflection, What Happened, she tried to answer the haunting questions. The world was waiting for the first female president of the United States, for inspiration and for the female population self-realization, some say. What happened that it did not happen? The whole world is eager to find out, and also more about the role of female politicians. Joining us in our Beijing studio, Joy Chen, a globally acclaimed Chinese-American author and former deputy mayor of Los Angeles. Welcome to our program.
Great to be here, Tian Wei.
Great to have you. Also joining us, Rick Dunham, who is co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University. Welcome, Rick.
Good to be
and
here.
Last but certainly not least, in Chicago, in the U.S., we are joined by Laura Schwartz, a political commentator who has worked at the White House during the Clinton years. Laura, good to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
Well, what happened or what happened? Laura, what do you think? What happened?
Well, I think the book is already doing so well for two ways I interpret what happened. I think it's what happened, how did I lose? Who was to blame? Both Hilary herself and others around her and outside forces. And then I think the other half of what happened will be very interesting for readers as well, being like, what happened behind the scenes? You know, behind that rope line, it's so interesting because campaigns are full of young and old alike, multi-generations that want to make change, that want to promote the solutions they feel are best for the problems at hand. So I think the book has two good focuses, and it's going to appeal to a very wide variety of audiences.
Well, we understand Laura is a cheerleader. She used to work for the Clinton White House. No wonder. But Joy, you know, there are very different commentaries coming out, whether about the book or about the attitudes reflected in the book, about how Mrs. Clinton is reflecting upon her campaign. There are accusations against her suggesting she's trying to blame everybody and everything else for her, quote, failure. Joy.
Well, I haven't read the book myself,
No.
but I follow the election pretty closely. Being a woman myself who's been involved in government service and public service and been an avid watcher for a long time in America, I think that what happened, I think there are myriad factors that went into her losing. I think Comey was certainly an issue, Russia was certainly an issue, and sexism and misogyny were an issue. And I think that there were issues with her own candidacy.
What do you mean by that?
I think that at the end of the day, to me, the biggest problem facing America is that a large swath of American people are scared for their future. I've heard it said that they've become the useless class, you know, that we have a huge gap between the skills of many, many Americans and the skills that are needed in a, in a global and technology oriented economy. So the fact that 70% of American adults lack a college degree, and the entire economy is spinning to a world where people need much more education and skills.
So you are saying actually she has not brought up enough convincing policies and also proposals. Laura, do you agree with that?
I heard part of that. I really believe Hillary had extensive policies and proposals during her campaign for true economic and education reform, among healthcare and a whole host of issues of which she was very policy solution oriented. But I think when it comes to what happened, it is, and she takes blame herself. James Comey, the FBI director, releasing a letter saying that the investigation into her emails was reopened 10 days before the election. That played a role. Russia's interference, we're finding out now, played more of a role. And perhaps, she turned this book into a publisher last June. Since then, we found out that the Donald Trump campaign, his son, Donald Jr., actually took a meeting with the Russians to find out supposed dirt on Hillary. Then, of course, she talks about Bernie Sanders, who was running against her, who brought up a lot of negative things that perpetrated more of a story. But her emails, I got to tell you, I think were at the base of it all.
Rick, what is it? Is it about the policies or lack of policies or lack of sufficient policies for the voters, or is it about something else?
Well, I think there are 20 reasons that we could give, but let me boil it down to a couple of things right now. Number one is, while she had a long list of policies that would help middle-class Americans, she did not connect with these people who felt they were being left out of the new economy, who were being left behind by changes in America and globally, that there was anything that she would do in particular that would change their plight, while Donald Trump said, I understand your pain and only I can fix it. So I think that that's more imagery. The second issue that I think is broader is that a lot of those people also have issues with a powerful woman who was running as the prototypical feminist of the 1970s. I mean, I compare it to Jesse Jackson as a presidential candidate versus Barack Obama. Jesse Jackson had problems breaking through to white America. Barack Obama did exceptionally well.
It seems a very interesting thing. That is, whether that female card or the way that the female card is being used or even quote unquote played is appropriate, is helpful at all. Joy, now in retrospect.
I think that Rick's point about Jesse Jackson is very interesting, because he talked about this rainbow coalition, and Hillary kind of did the same thing, right? You talked about Hispanics and blacks and say, I stand with the Muslims, I stand with the Mexicans, on the other side of the supposed border wall. But a lot of white Americans said, but I'm not part of a rainbow. Where's white on the rainbow coalition? And I think that they kind of had this sense of Hillary that she's not speaking for me. And the people who felt that she's not speaking for me just became too many. Young people, young white women who you think should be supporting her didn't support her to the level that they should. People always said that the housewives of the male Trump supporters, the wives would go into the voting booth and secretly pull the lever for Hillary. That never happened.
Didn't happen.
So somehow there was this visceral, lack of a visceral connection. How much of it was misogyny? How much of it was some personal affect of hers? I think it's hard to say. But there was this personal lack of an emotional connection with too many people.
Is that female card a successful one? Could it be a successful one now in retrospect? Laura.
I believe in the future there will be, Tian, and I think Hillary definitely started that journey to get women closer to the highest leadership position in the land. It's interesting. I understand what Joy's saying about the rainbow of colors, but when you look at like the suburbs of Philadelphia, the white Republican women were all breaking towards Hillary by about 23, 26%, but within the last 10 days of the election, she only wound up winning that area by 13%. So I think there were a lot of white working and stay-at-home moms that wanted to vote for her, but they were concerned as the email scandal came up again with James Comey that they just didn't want to enter into this much scandal, and look what we have now. So I think that really broke them away at the end, even though she still won by the majority of votes. I believe she's made headways, and I think right now focusing on how women can become more successful and more likable. And it's horrible to have to say this likability factor. Sheryl Sandberg, who wrote the book Lean In of Facebook fame, has done different studies and independent research, whereas men get more successful, they become more likable. As women become more successful in the corporate ladder and in politics, they become more dislikable.
But
so
Laura,
it's a very interesting dichotomy.
Yeah, well, there are other examples that we should have in mind when it comes to female politicians. For example, Angela Merkel.
Yes.
I mean, Angela Merkel has never been complimented by the press by the way she dresses. Let's just face the fact. And she's not necessarily going to be the darling of everyone in that country, but she's a very strong politician, and she seemed to be fearful. When we talk about whether there should be stereotypes against Hilary Clinton, there should be equivalent stereotypes, if that was true, against other female politicians. But obviously, in Angela Merkel's case, so far, Joy, it seems
Yeah.
that it didn't happen. I know Rick wants to say something from the men's perspective, and probably from a journalist's perspective, by the way. Joy, but first, very briefly.
You know, I think it also comes down to something called confidence, and it's something that women lack so much in every sector in society.
I think
But
you
I
and
see
Laura
that
certainly
so much
do
in
not lack of
politics.
confidence. My panelists are not lack of confidence here. But anyway, go ahead.
But I think that, you know, if you look at women and men more broadly, women tend to be competent. Men tend to be confident in the market. Women have competence, men have confidence.
Is this stereotype?
You know, there's actually been a lot of studies. There's been a whole book written about this called The Confidence Code by Katty Kay and Claire Shipman. And this one point I thought was so fascinating. And I think you see that in high relief in this election. No candidate has ever been more qualified or competent than Hillary. And Donald Trump, for everything that he is, he is confident. The thing about this confidence thing is that women try to develop this confidence and project confidence, but if it doesn't really come from inside, it comes across as stilted. Look at Donald Trump. He is totally confident in himself. But when you look at Hillary...
But how do you know if there's
she's
not much
pretending.
acting part? It seems to me there are also acting part from his part as well.
That bluster and bravado, I think that it does come from something. He believes
Bravado,
he should
ego.
be,
Well,
he should be president.
Okay.
And I think that people, all of us as human beings, we have a very sensitive meter for what's authentic.
I want to take us back to Angela Merkel,
Angela Merkel,
who you
okay.
mentioned, and
Great point.
Margaret Thatcher, because I have a theory which is that conservative women have an easier time reaching across, because you have a situation where conservative men will accept a conservative woman. In the United States, a Republican woman. Conservative men will vote for a Republican woman, but they get sensitive about voting for a Democratic woman or voting for a liberal woman. So I think it's easier for a conservative woman politician to be considered strong when a Democratic or a liberal politician is seen as being very strong. I mean, if Margaret Thatcher were a liberal Democrat, she would be called all sorts of names. So I think that it may not be overt sexism, but I think it is innate sexism in a lot of the more conservative voters, both in America and in Europe.
Laura, is that the point you want to embrace?
Yeah, I gotta say, Rick, that is a fascinating way to put it. I absolutely agree. I hadn't thought about it in that context before, but you're right. It doesn't always have to be an overt sexism, and there are all those underlying factors. Definitely, it falls in line of what I've seen when I look at it in the terms of conservative or liberal women. Definitely.
There's another issue which is important, that is for candidates, politicians as a whole worldwide, particularly female politicians. Which matters most, policies or personalities? Well, probably you could say in politics these days, actually policies do not matter that much at all for anyone, but probably, or is there any difference between, let's just say, two genders? Joy.
I guess from my own experience, personality becomes hyper important. And again, I think it's projecting who you are and letting people feel like I can really get to know the real her. Because immediately, this person is different. And I think it raises people's curiosity, but it also raises their defenses. So I think for women, it's especially important to project like, this is the real me, and I want to help you. And to create this thing that goes beyond identity. I think that the policy is very important. The policy needs to be coherent, something that you can say in 30 seconds, and include everybody, including those conservative whites who are scared when they take a look at you.
It's not just the United States we're talking about, also politics elsewhere in the world as well. Policies vis-a-vis personalities, which matter the most, particularly, let's just say, for female politicians worldwide. Laura, your judgment here.
For female politicians worldwide, I think among those that are already aligned with your party, fellow members of whatever party it may be, are going to look at your policies to choose between you and somebody else representing them. I think in order to get people to cross the line and come over, they oftentimes look for personality when their own candidate is lacking it. That's why I think Donald Trump did so well getting the Republicans that he did. His personality beat out Hillary's. Hillary herself has said she's not a campaigner in chief. You know, she likes working on policy and getting things done, but it's all part of it. You've got to communicate that policy in a way people can understand, and in a way that they'll understand how it affects them in the immediate.
Right. We talk about female politicians as if it is a special creature. Actually, it shouldn't, because politicians should be just politicians, no matter what their gender is. But the question is, how are we going to move on from here? And where are we? Rick, I want to have your judgment, because 1970s, you have the women's liberation movement going on in the United States, elsewhere in the Western world. And then you have this big hype of female participation in politics encouraged by Hilary Clinton and some of the other leading female politicians worldwide. But now, with their apparent failure, do you see a further gender balanced participation in politics, particularly on the very top of the ladder? Rick?
I do, and I think 2018, 2020 in the United States are going to be critical. 2018, you already have
not just the United States, elsewhere too. Your observation.
Exactly. And I mean, Britain, you have a woman as the Prime Minister. In France, you had a defeated woman, but she was not defeated because she was a woman. But when I say look at the United States, 2018 midterm elections, women are stepping forward to run, particularly as Democrats. You have war veterans, you have CEOs who are running, you have people who are elected officials locally who are running for higher office, and they see the opportunity. They don't see Hillary Clinton's defeat as a defeat for women. They feel empowered, and in 2020, I think you're going to have several very strong candidates who happen to be women, who happen to be senators, who could well be major presidential candidates or vice presidential candidates. Wow. But the difference is it will be the new generation. This is not going to be the generation of women who are fighting in the 70s and the 60s for rights. This is going to be the equivalent of the Barack Obama generation, the second generation, and it's going to be a combination of policy and personality. I mean, they will have to project a winning personality as well as policies that connect with average people.
Well said. Laura, your judgment here?
Yeah, I really agree, and I think that's, in a way, what's at the heart of Hillary's new book, What Happened, because it's almost like a salve for the people still reeling from her not getting elected and her supporters. But I think it's also a bit of a roadmap of what to avoid, especially as a female running for office. You know, she mentions in the book how here she was on the debate stage and she had Donald Trump, who's taller and a man looming over her. What was she supposed to do? I really believe that at the end of the day, what happened is not about saying, I told you so, but instead, here were my mistakes, here were the outside mistakes, and let's find a way to avoid them and empower women to run for state, local, federal office, not only in the United States, but around the world.
Right.
So I think Rick makes a really good point there. It's about empowering this generation, not defeating them.
Right. Joy, of course it's not just about the United States. The United States majorly the United States got the major coverage of what's happening because they're becoming the most powerful country in the world. But there's also a lot of equivalent stories happening around the world. You travel back and forth, China, United States, elsewhere too. What do you think is really happening?
I think that we're moving beyond an identity-focused world. I think that as we look to the next generation of people, you know, Donald Trump is out there railing against Muslims, railing against Mexicans, but young people, you know, they are looking beyond, is this person a woman? Young women, so many of them went for Bernie Sanders, you know, because they felt that he identified with them more closely and he had more solutions for them. And, you know, I've been amazed at the sudden acceptance of LGBT transgender issues in the United States and around the world in the last 3 years.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's hard to imagine that 5 years ago, the entire military or America would say, wait a minute, we should be able to let transgender people serve in the military.
Even though there's some bounce back at this point.
There's some bounce back, but the sudden general acceptance of people who are different from us among young people, I think, is really stark if you look at the difference between older people and young people. So I think we're moving beyond this more identity politics focused world, and young people will vote for the best candidate, not based on, is this person of the same tribe as me? And I think that's a great thing for the world.
With a very positive note, we're wrapping up this discussion for now. I'm sure we're going to have more about that and topics related. Joy Chen, Laura Schwartz, and Rick Dunham. What a pleasure to have the three of you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be with you, Jen.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Xin Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.